Chapter 1. Childhood in the Shadow of Rejection. James Oliver Huberty's story begins in the Rust Belt town of Canton, Ohio, during the final years of the Great Depression. Born on October 11, 1942, he entered a world marked by economic hardship, rigid religious values, and a fractured family structure that would leave permanent scars on his psyche. From a young age, Huberty experienced profound emotional turmoil. His mother, Isel Huberty, was a devout Mennonite, part of a conservative Christian sect known for its emphasis on modesty, pacifism, and separation from worldly concerns. But despite her faith's focus on family, Isel made a decision that would shape James's entire worldview. When he was still a child, she left the family to become a missionary in India. While some saw it as a noble calling, for James it was an unforgivable betrayal. He grew up feeling abandoned, unloved, and rejected by the person who should have nurtured him most. His father, Earl Huberty, tried to raise James and his older brother on his own. A hardworking man, Earl bought a small farm outside Canton, believing the rural setting would instill discipline and moral values in his sons. But instead, it created an isolated environment, removed from the emotional support James desperately needed. James was a quiet and socially awkward child. He didn't make friends easily and had difficulty relating to others. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed with polio, a crippling disease that left him with a lifelong limp. While he recovered without the use of braces, the physical impairment made him a target for bullying and deepened his sense of isolation. Rather than provide support, his father emphasized toughness and self-reliance. Emotional expression was discouraged. As a result, James grew into a moody, withdrawn adolescent who often retreated into his own thoughts. Teachers remembered him as bright but strange, intelligent in some ways, but deeply distrustful of others and prone to quick temper. As he matured, his inner world grew darker. He became increasingly obsessed with themes of power, rejection, and revenge. He showed signs of paranoia, convinced that others looked down on him or wanted to hurt him. Though there's no record of early violent behavior, the seeds of future rage had already been planted, fertilized by trauma, reinforced by social rejection, and left unchecked by those around him. Huberty graduated from high school and briefly attended a Bible college, possibly influenced by his mother's religious legacy. But his stay was short-lived and he soon left the institution, disillusioned and embittered. He then enrolled in the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science, where he earned a degree in embalming and funeral home operations. It was a curious career choice, one that, in retrospect, hinted at a mind increasingly drawn to death and control over the helpless. Despite the grim nature of his profession, he was reportedly good at it. But by the early 1970s, James had given up mortuary work and began moving through a series of blue-collar jobs, mostly as a welder or machine operator. These jobs were often temporary, and each layoff seemed to reinforce his growing belief that society had conspired against him. All of this, the abandonment, the illness, the isolation, and the economic frustration, combined to form a man with a deeply wounded psyche. By the time James reached adulthood, he had come to see the world as an enemy. He didn't just feel invisible, he felt wronged. And worse, he began to nurture the idea that someday he would strike back. This was not simply a story of mental illness or social isolation. It was the slow, tragic construction of a man who would one day turn his pain outward, unleashing it on innocent strangers in an explosion of violence that the world would never forget. Chapter 2. A Family Built on Fragility. By the late 1960s, James Huberty had settled into the next phase of his life, marriage and fatherhood. But far from grounding him, these changes would expose the deep cracks in his mental and emotional state, cracks that would grow wider over the next 2 decades. In 1965, Huberty married Etna Markland, a woman he had met during his time in Ohio. Etna was described by those who knew her as an unconventional and sharp-witted woman, with a personality as strong as her husband's. She came from a background nearly as troubled as James's own, and their union was, from the outset, built more on mutual dysfunction than stability. Nevertheless, they would remain married until the day of the massacre, nearly 2 decades later. The couple had 2 daughters, Zelia and Cassandra. To outsiders, the Huberty household appeared modest and unremarkable. But behind the closed doors of their home, chaos and paranoia thrived. Huberty ruled the house with an authoritarian hand. He was known to have a violent temper, And while Etna fiercely defended him after the massacre, some neighbors and acquaintances would later testify that James was physically abusive toward both his wife and children. But Etna was not a passive bystander. In several documented incidents, she reportedly responded to James's violent outbursts with equal aggression. On one occasion, she allegedly pulled a gun on him during a domestic dispute. Instead of serving as a moderating influence, Etna often mirrored his paranoia. The two shared a worldview laced with suspicion, fear, and grievance. They fed each other's delusions rather than challenging them. Etna was also deeply involved in James's increasingly erratic thinking. She claimed to be a clairvoyant and believed she could predict events through dreams and intuition. In one particularly disturbing example, she reportedly told James that she foresaw a dark future and that he had a role to play in it. Whether she genuinely believed this or simply played into James's fantasies is unclear, but the effect was chilling. She validated his worst instincts. The couple would spend long hours discussing their shared contempt for society, particularly what they saw as a corrupt government, an immoral culture, and a declining America. James frequently railed against immigrants, minorities, and the wealthy, blaming them for his own economic struggles. He was obsessed with what he perceived as the moral and financial decay of modern society, and he believed that violence might someday be necessary to correct it. This mindset only worsened as James moved from job to job, often fired or laid off through no fault of his own. He viewed each dismissal not as a consequence of the economy or company downsizing, but as a personal attack. The world, in his view, was closing in on him. And Etna agreed. As the years progressed, James's hobbies became more disturbing. He began collecting firearms and ammunition obsessively, purchasing a variety of powerful weapons, not for sport or protection but for what he saw as inevitable societal collapse. The family would take regular trips into the desert or forest where James would teach Etna and the girls how to shoot and survive in a post-apocalyptic world. These outings, framed as family bonding, were really survivalist drills, practice for the war he was convinced was coming. There were other signs of his descent. James developed an obsession with national tragedies, especially mass killings and high-profile crimes. He followed the news religiously, taking in stories of political unrest, violence, and war. He spoke often of conspiracies, believing that shadowy forces were controlling the economy and pushing people like him to the edge. Despite this increasingly unstable behavior, no formal psychiatric intervention ever took place. Etna never sought outside help, and when neighbors or acquaintances expressed concern, the family would retreat into themselves. They were a closed system, one where reality was shaped by their own fears and fantasies, completely impervious to outside influence. By the early 1980s, the family had relocated to San Ysidro, a border community in southern San Diego, California. The move was meant to be a fresh start, a last chance for James to find steady work and regain a sense of purpose. But instead, the relocation became the final stage of his unraveling. In San Ysidro, James found no work, no community, and no hope. His belief that he was a victim of an unjust world hardened into something far more dangerous. Combined with Etna's emotional instability and mutual encouragement of his darkest thoughts, his descent into madness became a family affair, and the consequences would soon shake the world. Chapter 3: The Breaking Point. By 1984, James Huberty was a man on the brink, emotionally hollowed out, economically broken, and increasingly obsessed with a world he believed had turned against him. His move to San Ysidro, California, was supposed to be a fresh start for his family. Instead, it became the final crucible in which his fury and despair would finally combust. San Ysidro, located at the U.S.-Mexico border near Tijuana, was a working-class community known for its dense population, linguistic diversity, and large immigrant presence. To someone like Huberty, already simmering with racist, xenophobic beliefs, it felt like hostile territory. He viewed the community's demographic shifts as another sign of America's decline. His paranoia intensified, now colored by racist delusions that white Americans like himself were being replaced and ignored. After arriving, he found himself unable to secure steady work. Though he had previously worked as a welder and security guard, his health was deteriorating. Years of stress and poor physical care had taken a toll. In early 1984, he injured his back while working and was placed on disability leave. It was a devastating blow. Not only did it rob him of his last sense of usefulness, but it plunged the family into financial instability. To make matters worse, James's already unstable behavior began spiraling. He would often speak to himself in angry monologues, pacing the house and ranting about the government, immigrants, and employers who had it out for him. His obsession with firearms became more alarming, not just as a survivalist hobby, but as a tool for what he now called retribution. He told Etna that he was going to do something terrible, something that would make people finally notice him. In January 1984, Huberty purchased multiple weapons, including a 9mm Uzi carbine, a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun, and a Browning HP 9mm pistol, all legally. Despite his growing instability, there were no background checks or mental health screenings in place at the time to stop him. He began stockpiling ammunition, preparing for an undefined confrontation with society itself. Around the same time, Etna began to grow more worried. She reached out to a local mental health clinic to request help for James, telling them she feared he might become violent. The receptionist took down the information and said a therapist would call back. No one ever did. On July 18, 1984, something inside James snapped. Earlier that day he took his wife and children to the San Diego Zoo, an outing that seemed on the surface surprisingly normal. But beneath it all, James was eerily calm. Etna would later say that her husband spoke during the trip of an impending catastrophe, and told her that something was going to happen that day, that he believed his troubles would soon be over. After they returned home, James sat quietly in his chair for a time, then reportedly told Etna, "I'm going hunting for humans." She didn't call the police. At approximately 3:56 p.m., James Huberty, dressed in a dark military-style shirt and armed with 3 guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, walked calmly into a McDonald's restaurant located at 522 West San Ysidro Boulevard. Inside were customers of all ages, from toddlers and teenagers to elderly couples, many of them Latino, reflecting the local population. What followed would be one of the most horrifying mass shootings in American history. But in those final moments before he opened fire, Huberty was calm, methodical, and eerily emotionless. He had come not in a fit of passion but with purpose, a plan forged from years of personal failure, paranoia, and rage, shaped by a belief that violence was the only remaining way to assert control over a world that had discarded him. He would go on to murder 21 people and wound 19 others in a 77-minute rampage before being killed by a police sniper. But the roots of that massacre were not planted on that day. They were nurtured across decades of psychological decay, family dysfunction, and a society that never intervened. Chapter 4. The McDonald's Massacre. Wednesday, July 18, 1984. The sun beat down on San Ysidro, California, as people went about their daily routines. At 4 p.m., the McDonald's on San Ysidro Boulevard was bustling. Families chatted over meals. Children played in the restaurant's small play area. Teenagers stood in line for fries and milkshakes. It was a slice of American life. Simple, familiar, unassuming. Then without warning, James Huberty walked in. He was heavily armed, dressed in dark pants and a combat-style shirt. He carried a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic, a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun, and a Browning HP 9mm pistol. All 3 guns were fully loaded, and he had hundreds of rounds of extra ammunition tucked into pouches and pockets. His movements were calm and deliberate, not a man in a frenzy, but one who had made a cold, conscious decision to commit mass murder. Huberty entered the restaurant just after 3:56 p.m. He didn't speak at first. Then turning to a customer he said, "Everybody on the ground." Within seconds he opened fire. The first shots. His first victims were a young couple and their infant daughter, seated near the entrance. He shot all 3. The baby, 21-month-old Carlos Reyes, was killed instantly by a shot to the back. The mother, Jackie, died soon after. This initial act set the tone for what would follow. Merciless violence, indiscriminate killing, no regard for age, gender, or innocence. As people screamed and dove for cover, Huberty began methodically hunting his victims. He moved from table to table, shooting people who were crouching under booths, hiding behind counters, or frozen in terror. Many were shot multiple times at close range. Some tried to play dead. A few survived that way. Most did not. Inside the killing zone, the restaurant quickly turned into a war zone. Blood and bodies covered the floor. Survivors later recounted that Huberty spoke intermittently, sometimes muttering to himself, other times taunting his victims. At one point he reportedly said, "I've killed 1,000 people. I'm going to kill more." He shot elderly people, teenagers and toddlers alike. There was no pattern to the killing except one. No one was safe. Victims included a group of teenage boys eating together. 2 were killed instantly, another paralyzed for life. An 11-year-old boy, killed while attempting to shield his 9-year-old friend. A fast food worker who died trying to help a mother and child escape through the back. A grandmother shot in the head as she prayed aloud. A 12-year-old girl who was hit multiple times but survived by playing dead beside her murdered friend. The violence was chilling not just for its scale but for its duration. Huberty's rampage lasted 77 minutes, an excruciatingly long time in which every second was filled with unimaginable terror. Law enforcement's response. Police were called within minutes, but early responders were ill-equipped and unsure of the situation. Some believed it was a robbery, others thought it was a hostage crisis. There was confusion about whether to storm the building or wait. Meanwhile, from inside, gunshots continued to ring out. It wasn't until 5:17 p.m., after more than an hour of killing, that a police sniper positioned on the roof of a nearby post office finally got a clear shot. A single bullet fired from a .308 caliber rifle struck Huberty in the chest, piercing his heart. He died instantly. Aftermath of a massacre. When police entered the building, the scene they encountered was like something from a battlefield. 21 people were dead. 19 more were wounded, many with life-altering injuries. The dead included children as young as 8 months old and adults as old as 74. Most were Latino or Mexican American, reflecting the local community. Though there is no evidence Huberty specifically targeted them for racial reasons, his deep xenophobia likely played a role in his mental state. The San Ysidro McDonald's massacre was, at the time, the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. It shattered the illusion of safety in public spaces and stunned the nation. Images of blood-soaked booths, broken glass, and grieving families flooded newspapers and TV broadcasts. In one chilling detail, Huberty had reportedly tried to contact a mental health center the day before, telling a receptionist he had problems and needed to talk to someone. The intake worker wrote down his name, but misspelled it and said someone would call him back. No one ever did. James Huberty came to McDonald's that day not to rob or protest, or even to make a political statement, but simply to kill. His rage was personal, his motives tangled in decades of rejection, failure, and delusion. He didn't see his victims as people. He saw them as symbols of the world that had turned its back on him. And when the killing was over, America would never again look at fast food restaurants, or public spaces, the same way. Chapter 5. A Nation in Shock. The news broke quickly and hit like a thunderclap. Mass shooting at McDonald's. Dozens dead in San Ysidro. As the sun set over Southern California on July 18, 1984, television screens across the United States flickered with images of horror. Shattered glass, yellow police tape, stretchers carrying bodies, and sobbing family members outside a fast food restaurant that had become a slaughterhouse. The massacre wasn't just a local tragedy, it became a national trauma. The sheer brutality and randomness of James Huberty's rampage left the public reeling. Until that day, America had never seen a civilian mass shooting on such a massive scale. People had died in shootings before, in homes, during robberies, even in schools, but never like this. A public place in broad daylight with dozens gunned down without warning by a man who offered no demands, no manifesto, and no mercy. The media frenzy. Within hours, national and international media descended on San Ysidro. The story dominated front pages and nightly newscasts. Cameras zoomed in on blood-stained floors, bullet holes in walls, and the grief-stricken faces of survivors. Reporters scrambled for any detail they could find. Who was the killer? Why did he do it? Was it terrorism? A political act? The horrifying reality began to take shape. James Huberty was not a member of a radical group. He was not a foreign operative. He was not a man with a cause. He was a loner, a disgruntled, paranoid individual with a history of mental instability, and he had legally acquired every weapon he used. For many Americans, this was even more frightening. He was an ordinary citizen. He could have been a neighbor. He could have been anyone. Profiles of the Dead. As the names and stories of the victims emerged, grief deepened. They were not nameless figures. They were children, mothers, grandfathers, teenagers, immigrants, and hardworking families. Many of the dead were Latino, with Mexican-American families who had come to the U.S. in search of a better life. Their stories painted a picture of everyday humanity. Neva Kane, 22, a McDonald's worker on her first day on the job. Victor Rivera, 25, who died shielding his 11-year-old nephew. Omar Hernandez, 11, who was saving his money for a new bike. Elsa Borboa Fierro, 19, a soon-to-be bride. Carlos Reyes, not even 2 years old, gunned down in his stroller. The personal scale of the loss devastated the San Ysidro community. Funerals were held back-to-back. Mourning families gathered for vigils. Local churches overflowed with people who struggled to process the carnage. Survivors were hospitalized not just with physical wounds, but with deep psychological scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Anger and accountability. In the days following the massacre, anger exploded, and it had many targets. Why didn't the police act sooner? Criticism was leveled at law enforcement for taking more than an hour to stop Huberty. Tactical confusion and lack of training for active shooter situations, which were virtually unheard of at the time, delayed the sniper's final shot. Some believed more lives could have been saved with a faster response. Why did no one treat Huberty's mental illness? Scrutiny turned to the mental health system. Days before the shooting, Etna Huberty had reached out to a local mental health clinic for help. James himself had reportedly tried to get counseling but was never followed up with. Bureaucratic missteps and an overwhelmed, underfunded system allowed a deeply disturbed man to slip through the cracks. Why was he allowed to buy so many guns? Huberty had legally purchased multiple firearms despite his evident instability. At the time, California law did not prevent the sale of high-powered semi-automatic weapons to individuals with no criminal record, even if they had a history of disturbing behavior. The Uzi alone could fire over 600 rounds per minute. Public outcry over gun laws erupted, particularly around assault weapons and background checks. Despite this outrage, no major federal gun control legislation immediately followed the massacre. A turning point in American violence. The San Ysidro McDonald's massacre redefined how Americans saw mass shootings. Before 1984, such attacks were rare and mostly limited in scope. After San Ysidro, they began to take on a new, terrifying pattern. A lone gunman fueled by rage or delusion, striking in public spaces, killing indiscriminately and without warning. It was one of the first mass shootings to change public behavior. Parents began worrying about taking their kids to restaurants. Schools started quietly preparing lockdown protocols. Police departments began rethinking their emergency response strategies, and the term mass shooter entered the national lexicon in a permanent way. While the McDonald's restaurant itself was eventually torn down, the massacre's psychological footprint could not be erased. It would become a template for future killers and a reference point for debates about mental health, gun laws, and public safety, debates that continue to this day. The massacre at San Ysidro wasn't just a tragedy. It was a watershed moment, a rupture in the American psyche that laid bare the consequences of unchecked mental illness, lax gun regulation, and social alienation. In the wake of James Huberty's rampage, one question haunted everyone. How many more would follow? Chapter 6. The Long Shadow. In the weeks and months after the massacre, San Ysidro struggled to return to normal. The community was shattered. Survivors bore not just physical injuries but invisible wounds, psychological trauma, guilt, fear, and a sense of security that would never fully return. Memorials were held, but they felt inadequate in the face of such senseless destruction. Families mourned quietly, often out of the public eye as media attention eventually faded. The site of the McDonald's, soaked in the blood of innocence, stood for over a year before it was finally torn down. In its place, a campus building for Southwestern College was constructed, a symbol of healing and rebirth, offering education where lives were once taken. But the horror cast a long national shadow. Although the massacre sparked outrage, especially over how Huberty legally obtained multiple firearms despite clear signs of instability, no major federal reform followed. The 1980s were not yet a time when mass shootings triggered sweeping legislative action. Instead, the San Ysidro massacre became a reference point, a chilling example used in future debates about gun control and mental health care. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing their protocols, but it would take decades, and many more tragedies, for the idea of an active shooter response to become standard. James Huberty's name was forever linked to mass murder, his face stamped in the media as the embodiment of twisted rage. But over time, focus began to shift away from the killer and toward the stories of the victims, their loved ones, and the community that survived him. The massacre also gave rise to a growing recognition of the failure of the mental health system. Huberty had shown warning signs for years: paranoia, delusions, aggressive outbursts, and had even reached out for help just one day before the attack. But his file was misplaced and no one followed up. That small administrative error may have cost 21 people their lives. For many, that's the most tragic detail. This massacre, horrifying as it was, might have been preventable. Final chapter: Memory and Meaning. Today, the 1984 San Ysidro McDonald's massacre is rarely mentioned alongside more recent mass shootings, yet it was one of the first to shock an entire nation. It marked the beginning of an American era haunted by public violence. The names of the victims, once read aloud at candlelight vigils, risk fading into history, but they should not. They were children, grandparents, students, workers, immigrants, dreamers. They were people whose lives were stolen not for political reasons, not in war, but by a man who believed the world had rejected him. The tragedy serves as a grim reminder that mass shootings are rarely sudden. They are often the end result of long neglected signs: untreated mental illness, toxic isolation, and easy access to deadly force. In remembering San Ysidro, we are not just recalling an event. We are honoring the lives lost and confronting the uncomfortable truth that such horrors often come with warning signs ignored. The story of James Huberty is one of devastation, but the story of his victims is one of resilience, grief, and remembrance. In their memory, the question endures: how can we stop the next one?